My teacher Rudi wrote some stories for the purpose of illustrating some of his teaching. I think my favorite story is the one where the architect and the saint were traveling together, wandering the world. Stop me if you've heard it. No, don't stop me. Most of you've heard it already. But they've wandered the world. And the saint was always entertained by the company of the wise man who was looking at everything and saying, this tree ought to be like this, and that rock ought to be over here, and this thing ought to be this way, and that thing ought to be that way. And one day they were coming, they had traveled a long time without eating, and they came over a hill to a meadow where there was a flock of goats. And as they approached the goats to milk one, the architect said, this goat's tits ought to be 6 inches higher. And so the saint went to the udder, and the architect went 6 inches higher. And the moral of the story is, take it where it is and not where you think it ought to be. What we think about how it ought to be, about anything ought to be, is only our ego talking, and it is absolutely useless. You know, we practice, if I were going to describe the simplest way I could what we practice contact, alignment, and flow. We practice contact, alignment, and flow in our bodies. Which activates the deepest healing capacity of this body to express itself in its broadest range of motion. We practice contact, alignment, and flow in our hearts. To realize ourselves, to realize our own self in the deepest possible way that we can, and to flow from our own source through this body into this field of experience, ever in alignment. We're also practicing contact, alignment, and flow between ourselves and the entire universe. And this contact, this connecting, is connecting with what is. You know, the second day, not what we think it ought to be. The second day I was in New York with Rudi, I was sweeping the stairs outside his brownstone on 10th Street before class, because I noticed it had gotten a little dirty out there, and I went out and swept it. And while I was sweeping, this guy came up to me who was ostensibly a student of Rudi's, and his name was Hans. And he said to me, "Oh, you're new here." And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Oh, how can you study with Rudi? You know, he's so fat." And I said, "Really? I didn't notice. All I've ever seen was, when I looked at him, was love." Hans, I guess, thought Rudi ought to be thinner. And some people thought he ought not to be, you know, in business. And everybody always has some kind of thought about something that we ought to be letting go of in order to extend our capacity to connect. Because it is connection, it is contact, alignment, and flow in every dimension of our life that wakes up our own creative resource and facilitates its expression through the field of our life. When I was a young person just starting to teach, and for a while after that, I thought there's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. Now I think the fact that anything ever gets done is a miracle, and each and every day that I wake up and start to express myself, I establish contact and flow within me, and the rest of it is an experiment. Every day. Maybe in a linear world, how it ought to be is a straight line. And easy to say. And sometimes I wish we lived in a linear world. It would be a lot simpler. But we don't. And so, feeling into our hearts, I should first say, quieting our minds and feeling into our hearts, we let go of our ego and all of the ways in which we think it ought to be, to connect to the reality of our own self and the reality of each other, and begin to hold, without any kind of judgment, a completely open and loving space from within ourselves for everyone that we share our life with, finally that being everybody on earth. Well, apparent and not so apparent, everybody on earth. Be the wise person, and if you're hungry, take it where it's at. Don't go eating where you think it ought to be, because it ain't.